I'm Kathy Woodward, Director of the Simpson Center for the Humanities at the University of Washington in Seattle, and it is my great and good pleasure to welcome you all to this session, the Srinivas Aravamudan Memorial Lecture. The purpose of this lecture is to honor his wonderful memory and also to pay tribute to groundbreaking and inspiring research in the humanities, hence Akira Lippit, who is our speaker for this afternoon. Srinivas, as we called him, was an award-winning scholar of 18th century literature here at Duke University, and he was a brilliant, I'd say actually magical leader in the academy. And in fact, I now think of the academy as necessarily a global academy, in great part thanks to him. At Duke, he served as director of the Franklin Humanities Institute, as dean of the humanities, and for us, importantly, gathered here today as president of the consortium, the CHCI, as president, twice, in fact, until we lost him to cancer in 2016. Those of you who knew him know that he had a passion for conversation, long conversations, and a love of the arts. He was a traveling man in my eye. He traveled in the world of ideas. He traveled geographically around the globe, and he put into practice his ambitious vision of the consortium as an enlivening and influential and consequential network of humanities centers around the globe, and which you all represent. This is a vision he built with others, of course, and importantly, with the support of the Mellon Foundation, which had become convinced by his eloquent and persistent advocacy at the Mellon Foundation of the urgent need for the humanities in the age of the Anthropocene to respond to that, among other things. And I want to say too, that Srinivas had a warm and welcoming heart, and he led a rich and intensely social intellectual life. His intensely social intellectual life was marked by an ethos, an ethics of the theoretical and the practical practice of hospitality, which was very important to him. And so now I'm turning to Richard Neer, who, as I mentioned, is going to introduce Akira Lippit to us all. He's director of the Franklin Institute for the Humanities at the University of Chicago, where he's also a professor in art history, cinema and media studies in the college. He's the author of, among other things, Greek Art and Archaeology and New History, and he is the co-editor of Critical Inquiry.
Wonderful. It's a great pleasure and an honor to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Akira Lippit. Lippit is Vice Dean of the faculty in the School of Cinematic Arts and Professor in Cinema and Media Studies, Comparative Literature, and East Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Southern California. He's published 4 books starting in 2000 with a pioneering intervention in animal studies, Electric Animal, just mentioned a moment ago, Electric Animal, Toward a Rhetoric of Wildlife, followed by Atomic Light, Shadow Optics of 2005 on film and physics and much else, about which I'll have more to say in a moment. Then Cinema from a Theory of Experimental Film and Video of 2012. Most recently, Cinema Without Reflection, Jacques Derrida's Echopoiesis and Narcissism Adrift. And if that weren't enough, Lippit's also the general editor of Discourses, so he's basically been publishing multiple edited volumes every year. It's a shelf of publications that's notable both for its breadth and for its impact. That is, each of these studies has proved consequential in multiple fields. He's a truly global comparativist, and in that sense epitomizes the ethos of CHCI and the eponym of this lecture, Srinivas Aravamudan. Now, part of me feels that it's a bit of a fool's errand to try to reduce a dossier of such breadth and complexity to a short introduction. Like many of us, I think I have enough trouble trying to figure out what holds my own work together without trying to sum up anybody else. That is, in a way, what being in a humanities center is all about. Nonetheless, this is my job, and so stepping back, I want to make two observations about Lippit's oeuvre, one structural and the other thematic. The first structural observation, which is fairly general, is that Lippit is a profoundly dialectical thinker. Again and again, he explicitly addresses himself to the mutual relational constitution of his objects and his concepts, both at the macro level of cultural studies and at the micro level of specific cases, levels that are themselves, of course, mutually determined. The second thematic observation is that the specific dialectic that seems to interest him the most is the great big Hegelian one of human freedom or self-legislation on the one hand, and natural law on the other. Not that Lippit is a Hegelian himself, far from it. But one thread that connects his early work on animality, the electric animal, with his later work on the physics of light, atomic light, is precisely the mutual dialectical implication of the subject and natural law and the consequences, both cultural and conceptual, of that dialectic. And one way to think of the project is as an immanent critique of idealist historicism. That is, Lippit traces the adventures of these dialectics diachronically and globally in ways that bring out the failure or blockage of sublation and the consequences, which might even be called existential, of that failure. In disciplinary terms, this puts him squarely at the juncture of humanities and STEM, or better, at the gap that separates and thereby constitutes them. So, for instance, the electric animal was about, to be grossly reductive, the way that animals are in modernity at once the antithesis of technology and its very epitome, such that the animal is at once a figure of pure mechanism, think Descartes, and the very model of the speechless, the poor in world, the irrational or alogos. As Lippit put it in 2002, the antitheses of animal and technology are united without, however, producing a sublation. And it's in the interstitial space of that unresolved sublation that Lippit goes to work both as a critic and as an historian. His best known work, I think, is probably Atomic Light, Shadow Optics of 2005, which pursues a dialectic of light and shadow in three domains, with particular reference to post-war Japan. Cinema, which projects light and shadow onto a flat screen or shadow curtain, and in so doing, typically, if not inevitably, produces a particular visual experience of surface and depth. X-ray photographs, which use high wavelength light to penetrate surfaces and cast flat shadows onto plates. And the ghastly or ghostly shadows that atomic bombs left of certain victims on the walls of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it's sort of thesis antithesis, unresolved non-synthesis. The last term, atomic traces, being not so much a synthesis or Aufhebung of the previous two as an annihilation of the categories. So the book winds up being about what Lippit calls avisuality, in which the alpha privative prefix doesn't just negate visuality, as in blindness, but rather tries to capture the mutuality of visibility and invisibility in, for example, the use of non-visible light, X-rays, to produce visible indices of invisible structures. And the book traces these themes, which are also technologies, in roughly diachronic fashion to argue for the new experience of light in basically technocratic modernity. This historical dimension is essential because it shows how what counts as natural law is itself variable, which means that what counts as mechanism, even what counts as necessity or logic, will likewise be so. It's not a mere pun to say that the book is dazzling and brilliant. On the contrary, Lippit helps us to see why such terms trip so easily off the tongue and what's at stake when they do so. Ex Cinema, again, pursues this theme of the negative that's incorporated into that which it names to describe avant-garde cinema in and as an unsublated negation of movies. There's a family resemblance between the concept of ex cinema and Atomic Light's conception of avisuality. In this case, though, the relationship negative and positive, privative prefix and root term maps weirdly onto Los Angeles itself, so the reader can start to see the USC campus and Hollywood as an uncanny spatialization of the argument. More recent still is a fascinating series of essays on David Lynch, the great poet of impulsion and compulsion, the avisual and the non-sublation of embodied self-legislation, which will, I believe, appear soon as yet another book. Today, though, his title is Persona non grata, And in the spirit of dialectical antitheses, I want to express the exact contrary or opposite of that idea, if I may, and ask you please to join me in giving the warmest of welcomes to a scholar and intellectual who's also a person, not just a persona or mask, and who is very grata indeed, and is deserving, both in retrospect and in anticipation of what we're going to hear, of our gratia, or gratitude, that is our thanks. So please join me in welcoming Akira Lippit.
So I already cannot live up to that introduction. I should just point out, thank you, Richard, for that incredibly detailed and moving introduction. And I should point out that was me, like pre-2020. So the introduction is kind of forcing me to face myself, former self, of which I am now merely a shadow of. So, but thank you. And Kathleen, thank you also for remembering that moment in 1999, which is such a special set of encounters. In fact, Discourse, the journal that Richard was kind enough to mention, had one of its most productive iterations under Kathleen's stewardship, editorship at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. So let me start just by welcoming everybody, and then I'm going to unwelcome all of you in just a moment. And to thank the Consortium of Humanities Centers and Institutes and the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute here at Duke University for this invitation to face-to-face forms of humanities, and to Ranjana Khanna and Sarah Geyer for this kind invitation. It is a singular honor to be allowed to speak under the title of Srinivas Aravamudan and the memorial lecture and his contributions, as Kathleen noted already, to the humanities endure and continue to not just form and inform, but to shape the many conversations that we have after his untimely departure. To receive that invitation from Ranji is, of course, especially meaningful and powerful to me. Just want to thank Chris Chia and Jennifer Cho for their hospitality and for all the arrangements in bringing me here today. The title of this event, Face to Face, of course, invokes and provokes for many of us, all of us, in fact, forget it, all the memories that we've, and all the struggles and all the various discoveries that we've made over the past several years. And it suggests, I think, and I'm stuck on this title, Face to Face, because it seems so necessary in a way and predetermined that we would reach a moment where we could say with a straight face that we are face to face. And it invokes a series, let's say, of correctives, the suggestion perhaps that we are returning to something that involves this notion of a face-to-face, something which had been lost perhaps or suspended over the past several years, or if not distorted in the sense not entirely of an effacement, but of a defacement perhaps, in which we were asked to consider the strange, to refer to Richard's point, dialectical options. And I didn't realize I was such a dialectical thinker, but thank you for saying so. Between the idea of seeing one's face and being not in person at a distance, or to be in person, as we've learned, and not see one's face in its entirety. And the idea, of course, of face-to-face is that we are together somehow. The implication is more than just the surface of our visage, of the facade, as it were, but that somehow being face-to-face means we are together in person, in the educational context, in the Socratic sense of pedagogy, together, as it were, in the flesh. It also suggests that we are now at a stage of unmasking, which might also be to say of revealing, exposing, or facing one another truthfully, as if to mask were fundamentally a form of deception, that to be masked was to hide, to dissimulate, to withdraw, as it were, or to retreat, to be something less than truthful or honest. And as Richard very kindly said and smartly pointed out, there is something about the face, about seeing one's face, about sharing one's face with another, which again implies, it suggests, this is all implicit, that we welcome back one another. We welcome back one another after a pause or suspension of an absence, as it were. And this was the rhetoric, right, that we used certainly in the university and college, and well, I should say broadly in the educational world, of welcoming people back to campus. And I want to underscore the campus here as a kind of a home, a place where we belong, a place where we spend time together, as a unique social space that brings people together, and the suspension of that space would result eventually in this moment of return, in which we would welcome one another back to this shared space, this communal space, utopic, atopic, perhaps, idealized, imaginary, the campus, right? A place that binds us, as it were. But I began to ask, well, who welcomes whom back? Right? Who does the welcoming, and who gets welcomed? What are the terms of that gesture? I'm one of them too, so I can speak on behalf of administrators, and I don't say it with any disparaging intent, but that was part of a discourse of the university administration, to welcome back, which is also to take a certain kind of proprietary relation to the campus, as if to say, we are allowing you, we are welcoming you to come back. But really, this notion of face-to-face, and I'm going to sort of emanate a little bit into some of the global and environmental and eco-critical forces that shape this moment for all of us. The question keeps coming up for me, am I welcome? And when I ask, am I welcome, the question also should be heard as, are you welcome? And where do we go when we're not welcome, when we're no longer welcome? What does it mean to be persona non grata? I'm going to read a paper. I'm going to just say it flat out. It's the first thing I've written in 2.5 years. I was saying to somebody that I've probably written more words than I ever have in my life, and yet all of them were somehow words and sentences that will vanish somewhere into nothing. And I was really excited by the opportunity to come here and to be among such distinguished speakers and guests and interlocutors, and to be allowed once again to be permitted, as it were, to think a little bit, which I've tried to do. And I have to say that it was really fun to write again. But in reading and preparing and rereading, there is a kind of hysteria that drives everything I've written. So please accept it as a writing of someone who's not well, and that, and I will ask you to help me in this process of healing. The very notion of an unwelcome person, of a persona non grata, which is also used as to suggest someone who doesn't exist, right? Someone whose existence has been suspended, as it were. And it occurred to me that this is an act of such brutal force and violence. And yet it made me think, that maybe it's not restricted to that kind of very narrow juridical and diplomatic usage. In fact, we might need to think further about the extent to which individuals can be named personae non gratae, and perhaps to the pervasiveness with which that speech act is produced and enforced upon so many people, so many persons. I also have to say, in listening to Ranji's introductory remarks yesterday, and Kathleen pointed out our first encounter in 1999, which I also remember really well, and Ranji, I think, and I met here at Duke probably in the early 2000s, most likely about 20 years ago. And even though I don't see her nearly as often as I would like, I feel like I am constantly in conversation with her work and her thinking. And listening to her introductory remarks yesterday, I felt, I wish there had been a way that I could have given my presentation before her introduction, course, is sort of impossible because she said so much of what I'm trying to say elegantly, thoughtfully, precisely, as she always does, with such erudition and elegance. And I have to say that earlier, you know, Massimo's keynote about Pinocchio's nose really got in my head. I probably shouldn't have listened to it, right? Like I should have just waited for the recording and looked at it later. And it really made me think, you know, of course, in the psychoanalytic readings of Pinocchio, it's always a kind of displaced arousal, right? It's a body that is not yet fully organized in the human sense. And so stimulation or excitement and the connection between lying and a certain kind of sexual arousal in Pinocchio's nose is the way that most people dismiss perhaps the complexity of that figure. And in listening to Massimo, you know, talk about the way in which Pinocchio's morality is linked to this kind of pre-human body, this body that is not yet human. And he mentioned Deleuze and Guattari, and I was reminded of a sentence that Deleuze and Guattari, I think in Mille Plateau, they say that drunkenness is the eruption of the plant in us. And I've always been so struck by this idea that that there is this kind of elemental interiority in the human body, and that it's unleashed uniquely in the human organization by fermented plant. That causes a kind of not only intoxication, but a euphoria and a kind of pleasure. And it occurred to me that that nose that grows from that block of wood might also be the eruption of the tree or of plant life in the human body, and that it might be understood that way, that Pinocchio's quest to become human is a passage not merely from the automaton or the inanimate, the puppet, into the human figure, but rather something like the passage through the earth and the passage through this slow plant life that grows into and through the body of Pinocchio, ultimately into the human figure. So I'm going to need to think about that for some time. Persona non grata. So where should we start? Where does it start? Anthropocene, history, humanity. To know where it begins, we would need to know that it ends. Not just that it's ended, but that it does end, that it does come to a close. So it always begins at the end or just after. We might begin by asking about the state of humanity, about its health, but also about its relation to the state, about the general relationship between humanity and the state. Is humanity, its conception and practice, bound by a state, an effect of it, which is also to say, is it a condition? Is humanity regulated by the state? Is it constituted in and by the state? Or does it exceed, which is also to say precede and perhaps survive the state as an essence, the essence of humanity that transcends the state unconditionally? If a condition, then humanity would be conditional, subject to the forces that shape and form it. Humanity would appear in various iterations across space and time, a distinct, finite humanity, marked each time by the differing conditions of history. A series of humanities that live and die catastrophically across history. But if humanity is essential, if we understand it as essential, then humanity would be unified everywhere, consistent across time, and invariable, that is, unconditional. But can we say, you and I, that either is possible, one or the other? Can humanity, yours and mine, but also theirs, be either conditional or unconditional, a state or an essence? I'm sorry, I have to interrupt myself because I'm hearing Richard's comment about the dialectical tendencies in my work and the way in which the dialectic is always at some point negated itself as a logic of thinking. And so thank you, Richard, for pointing out this habit. Is there an alternative? Wouldn't any definition of humanity always signal an outside, that which is without humanity elsewhere? Wouldn't a true humanity always include that which is both non as well as no longer human, ex-human? In this sense, wouldn't the very notion of humanity include that which it isn't? And if so, wouldn't such a humanity be obligated to welcome the non-human, no longer or ex-human, in the form of a universal hospitality? A humanity which is not one, neither conditional nor essential, neither nor, but also always its inverse, a humanity defined by its excess, by that which it exceeds, and its own excess. Is this where humanity resides today? A humanity seemingly pressed and depressed to the point of breaking apart. No longer one, this humanity would need to be understood in the plural humanities, a shattered humanity no longer capable of facing itself, let alone another, inhospitable, a humanity marked by its antithesis, a humanity, inhumanity, an unforgiving humanity, unforgiving and unforgiven. Perhaps we need to start even further back and ask to whom we refer when we say we. Is such collectivity, the first plural, even possible? Can one today say we? Do we even exist, collectively and together, you and me? In contrast to the non-binary designations, they, them, which engender a plurality of selves no longer bound by the laws of singularity, perhaps the imagined community we once called we has splintered into an inoperable collective of broken singularities, faceless singularities in a world of personae non gratae. From diplomatic practice, the phrase persona non grata refers to an individual that is no longer welcome, literally someone that is no longer pleasing, a displeasing other that blocks, in the deepest psychoanalytic sense of the term, the possibility of my pleasure. The pleasure I take in the other, in my hospitality as host to the other. In the diplomatic world, a persona non grata is someone who, through violation, is no longer welcome, banished, one might say, effaced. This person has ceased to exist, and as such is no longer visible. In precise legal terms, such individuals have lost immunity from prosecution, the immunity that is typically extended to diplomats. Without immunity, they exist in the state corpus as nobodies or antibodies. They become figures of the non-immune. Diplomats, by contrast, are never bound by the laws of their hosts. They are guests that continue to live at home, even while abroad, and are, by definition, always at home wherever they are. A diplomat is, in principle, never elsewhere. And yet, such immunity, such homeliness can be revoked upon trespass when a seemingly limitless, but ultimately imaginary horizon of homeliness is crossed. The ex-diplomat is rendered persona non grata. Hospitality revoked, the persona non grata becomes at once a stranger, estranged, foreign, homeless. The homeless, we might add, those we that are inhospitable, the homeless and to homelessness, those we that are inhospitable to the homeless and to homelessness, are similarly unwelcome strangers, personae non gratae, perpetual refugees, wherever they happen to be. Aside from referring to certain individuals as unwelcome or unpleasant or non-existent in diplomatic scenarios, how might we understand more broadly the designation of anyone as unwelcome? What does it mean to refuse hospitality to another, regardless of their trespasses? And what happens to the human being that refuses hospitality to another? To trespass is to commit the criminal offense of entering unlawfully. It is the transgression of being elsewhere, unwelcome, uninvited, and stateless. To trespass is to render oneself foreign a foreigner, to become a guest, a ghost, stateless. Again, to be homeless, even in one's own country. Why connect humanity to hospitality? When has hospitality ever been essential to the conception and practice of human being? Humanism, the law of human being, may be the constitution that defines the practice and ethos of humanity. Whatever violences are tolerated and allowed, indeed permitted and demanded, one could say, against the non-human, the animal, woman, racial and ethnic minority, foreigner, queer, are defined as non-human. In the Humanist Manifesto, wouldn't all humanity be bound by the obligation to extend welcome and hospitality to all human beings once so defined? I'm sorry for the somewhat condensed and telegraphic nature of this statement. Humanism requires that one extend a hospitality to all those we define as human. And of course, the trick is that you define as non-human those to whom you wish to, whom you wish to withhold hospitality. And there is, of course, a very long history of dehumanizing, quite literally, enemies in war, or as earlier we heard in the keynote, Jews during the Third Reich as animals. Right? And once rendered animal, the laws of humanism no longer require that hospitality. Wouldn't the first article of the Humanist Constitution require a universal human hospitality? If so, then to deem someone persona non grata would be also to reclassify them as non-human and relieve the host of this obligation, since hospitality would only ever apply to the human. Although an effect of politics, the persona non grata is neither friend nor enemy, vanishing instead into a world without politics. This is a phrase from Carl Schmitt. They, personae, transcend politics, falling into the shadows of the state, stateless. Personae non gratae are no longer contingent nor conditional. They are unconditional in their absence. They become absolute foreigners. For Jacques Derrida, the question of hospitality returns invariably to language, to national languages, and to the law. And I should say here, just by way of interruption, the last set of seminars that Derrida gave that culminated in his unfinished and massive seminar, The Beast and the Burden, at the time of his death, there is a build-up to that seminar. Massimo mentioned earlier today the Cerisy-La Salle. There was I think, 97. I was there at when Derrida introduced his first iteration of The Beast and the Burden. And I remember he was scheduled to speak for 2 sessions, which is to say 2 blocks of time, and he spoke for 2 days. And he said it was a fraction of what he was writing, and said that this would be the biggest seminar he ever gave. And it was a seminar that he never finished. But I would say, in a kind of overdetermination, that this final question that he asked, which is of the outlaw, of the figures that stand outside of the law, the sovereign on the one hand, and the animal who is unprotected by the law, that these 2 figures for Derrida would become the framework for a series of inquiries that he had raised in the build-up to this last major seminar, which included his seminar on the death penalty. It included his seminar on hospitality, on the politics of friendship, on the question of democracy. All of these, I feel, were part of the constitutive elements of an inquiry unfinished that led him to this place of the human. Right? And of course, the sovereign would be exceptional in that sense, the one who presides over the law but is not bound by it. And then the animal that exists, or the beasts that exist, always in the plural for Derrida, outside of the law, which is also to say outside of the protection of the law. I thought, as we start to think through the various configurations of the face, to return to especially to Derrida's interventions on hospitality, which were written at the end of the 20th century, and to revisit the questions that he was raising there in light of the 20 years that have intervened since, the 22, 23 years, 25 years that have intervened since he delivered these lectures in his seminar, and to rethink the terms by which a hospitality, one that is already impossible in Derrida's thought, might be further rendered and further problematized, I would say, by everything that has happened since he delivered those lectures. And I say this hesitatingly because I don't simply want to use as easy sources of references some of the travesties of not only the past few years, but of the past few weeks. The eruption of a violence that is shocking when we see it, and yet so familiar as to be immediately put into a sequence of violence that seems to have no point of origin, and perhaps no point of destination. To think in the broadest terms around the questions of homelessness, of sexual identity and identification, of the refugee, of endless scenarios of refugees, the question of hospitality, and the terms by which we might even cling to the possibility that such a thing may, in fact, exist, that such a thing might, in fact, be performed at some point. Of hospitality, Derrida turns and returns to Socrates' apology, to his trial, where Socrates begins by distancing himself from the language of the courts, a language he insists is foreign to him. And I would add that the trial, that quintessential scenario of the state, right, is also one that requires a face-to-face. So when we talk about the warmth that facing another, and in that Levinasian tradition of responding to the other generates, we have to also think about the juridical and the ways in which the state enacts a perpetual state of trial and configures the face-to-face as a courtroom. And we would have to think the ways in which the courtroom is also an element of, and perhaps absorbed and interiorized within this space we call lovingly the campus. From Derrida's of hospitality, he, Socrates, has to ask for hospitality in a language which by definition is not his own, the one imposed on him by the master of the house, the host, the king, the lord, the authorities, the nation, the state, the father, etc. The personage imposes on him translation into their own language, and that's the first act of violence. That is where the question of hospitality begins. Must we ask the foreigner to understand us, to speak our language in all the senses of this term, in all its possible extensions, before being able, and so as to be able to welcome him into our country, end quote. Elsewhere, Derrida has said, when asked, I believe it's an interview published in Radical Philosophy, he was asked by his interviewer, what would justice be? And he says very briefly, which is remarkable for Derrida, justice would be speaking to the other in the other's language. And it's a very potent and very beautiful articulation, I think, of what the stakes for Derrida would be of justice. And so here, using the scenario of the trial, and here distinguishing languages not by their linguistic differences, but by their idiomatic differences. Socrates will protest that on trial he will be asked to speak a language that is not his. It is not the language that he does not speak in a linguistic sense, but it is not a language that he is capable of speaking in an idiomatic, ethical, political sense, which is here the language of the court. Derrida asks, would the first act of hospitality, that which enables hospitality, require first, that the other speak to us in our language. The other's language, imposed on Socrates by the state, the language of the state, is an idiom. The words are the same, but the language as such of the inhospitable host renders Socrates a foreigner. He trespasses in a language that is not his, a language that estranges him in the eyes of the court. Although Socrates is on trial, Derrida suggests that to ask for hospitality in a language which by definition is not his own, the one imposed on him by the master of the house, is in some manner always a juridical event a priori, and that languages have the power to transform communities into courts, communication into trials. To impose translation here, says Derrida, is the first act of violence. To respond to the host in the host language is to seek asylum, to plead for hospitality. Before the law, I am always foreign, seeking refuge from the violence of the law and the law of violence. Socrates' trial underscores an important point that Derrida pursues. One does not have to be already foreign to be unwelcome. One can be made foreign, persona non grata, by the law and through the violence imposed by the host's language. Roland Barthes, in a very different manner, says something very similar in his book on Japan, The Empire of Signs. In the opening prologue, Barthes says what a relief it is to be abroad because he doesn't have to hear French, and to be in Japan and just hear people talking and not understanding anything. And he talks about the aeration, just hearing people breathing and enunciating and speaking without the violence of having to listen to the language that is actually being spoken. And Barthes, who almost never really complains about anything, the one time he really complains is about the French language, which he says is always situating you in relationship to the one who speaks. It defines for you your place, your status, your worth, your value, all of those things, he says. It's a good thing he doesn't understand Japanese, because Japanese does it even more, I think, than French. But against Emmanuel Levinas, Derrida imagined hospitality as the suspension of language. He says, here's a quote from Derrida, as Levinas says from another point of view, language is hospitality. Nevertheless, we have come to wonder whether absolute, hyperbolical, unconditional hospitality doesn't consist in suspending language, particular determinate language, and even the address to the other. Derrida, who's, I think, one of the great readers of Levinas and also one of his great critics, will challenge the idea that Levinas extends, that language is itself hospitality. And Derrida takes it further by saying, wouldn't a true hospitality require not only the suspension of language, but even the suspension of an address, right? Even of speaking or addressing oneself to the other, further complicating a certain utopic, let's say, notion of face-to-face. Language, and more precisely, the demand to speak, to respond to interrogation, may form the limits, the borders for Derrida of hospitality. In this sense, the courtroom, where the lawmaker or king, the archeon, presides, is a state archive, but also a hospital. It is where hospitality and the conditions of hospitality are adjudicated. The house of the wounded, where one is treated, but also as the very condition of this treatment. Wounded. Is there any clearer sign of the crisis in hospitality than the ongoing attacks against hospitals, healthcare workers, and care as such? It will be one of the enduring madnesses of the past 2.5 years that healthcare workers, whom we applauded at the outset of the pandemic, ended up being targeted and followed home into the parking lots and harassed and in instances attacked. To attack the hospital and all of those who work in the area we call healthcare, to me is, if nothing else, a crisis not only of the hospital, but of hospitality itself. Derrida further distinguishes between the foreigner and the absolute other. The foreigner says Derrida, aligning with the rhetoric of diplomacy, is a guest in my home. But isn't hospitality a universal right, the host's obligation? Between the foreigner and the absolute other, Derrida discovers a paradox in the laws of hospitality, namely that true hospitality would exceed and even break the law, that a genuine hospitality would exist beyond transgression and mark itself a trespass of the law as such. He says, absolute hospitality requires that I open up my home and that I give not only to the foreigner, provided with a family name, with the social status of being a foreigner, etc., but to the absolute unknown anonymous other, and that I give place to them, that I let them come, that I let them arrive and take place in the place I offer them without asking anything of them, either reciprocity, entering into a pact, or even their names. The law of absolute hospitality commands a break with hospitality by right, with law or justice as rights. I'm struck by the radicality of this view. The idea that hospitality is not welcoming the other, the asylum seeker, the refugee, the immigrant, the homeless into one's home, but it is to break the very law of hospitality itself. Right? That in fact, the rules of the household, and Derrida has, elsewhere read through Klosowski and his notion of hospitality, of giving one's own, giving oneself, one's spouse, actually, to the guest here, but always maintaining the rules of the household. And for Derrida, hospitality, imagined in any form of authenticity, would in fact also have to break its own rules, which is to say, to break the laws of hospitality as such, in fact, to break the law. In Derrida's view, hospitality can only exist in an absolute form, which is to say limitless, beyond the law, and without any possibility of exchange or reciprocity. There can be no pact, he says, which is why hotels, which are hosts, are not institutions of hospitality because you pay them. There is a reciprocity, right? The hospitality is bought and purchased for the guest in a hotel. Its very promise, hospitality, is constituted and fulfilled in this practice of breaking the law. It is, following Derrida's logic, elsewhere a gift. And this is why I say that there is a long build-up to Derrida's final seminar around, for example, the question of the gift. And Derrida, there he's reading Mauss and this notion of potlatch and other kinds of destruction or mechanisms or economies of the gift, and suggests that a true gift would be given without any exchange, right? Without any expectation of loyalty or friendship. It would be the exact opposite of, for example, a bribe. The gift of hospitality must be unconditional and cannot be revoked. The possibility of its cancellation would already render such hospitality compromised and inauthentic. True hospitality can never be rescinded. Not only can hospitality never be conditional, the very terms of hospitality that I give the foreigner and even the absolute other, including the non-human, is also to give them place, the right to be here and to name the other as family, to share with the foreigner and other my name. A genuine hospitality would offer refuge to another, to even the absolute other who, accepting hospitality, would never be a refugee. Hospitality would welcome the refugee into my home, would share my name with each and every refugee, and would efface the very terms of refugee as such. I give to the other my place and would never accuse that other of replacing me. Although there is no reciprocity. There is nonetheless reversibility. The hôte, as many who've commented on the French, is both a host and a guest. Not one and the same. One is not both host and guest at once, but reversibly. If I extend hospitality to another, I am in this gesture also other. I am in turn subject and object of hospitality, and as such exceed any dialectical exchange. Hospitality requires that I give place to and also assume the place of another. In extending hospitality, I am also subject to it, because if there is no reciprocity, there can in turn be no subject proper to its giving. Who gives? It gives. To declare another persona non grata, then, is to expose the hospitality and immunity extended to the other as provisional, as having always been provisional, conditional, that is, subject to review. Such is the contradiction and violence contained in the practice of hospitality. Hospitality, says Derrida elsewhere, carries its own contradiction incorporated into it, a Latin word which allows itself to be parasitized, by its opposite, hostility. The undesirable guest, or hôte, which it harbors as the self contradiction. In a essay that Derrida wrote prior to his seminar, or perhaps during his seminar on hospitality, called Hospitality. It's a very awkward combination, fusion of the words hostility and hospitality. Derrida points out that, in fact, the same idea exists in both. And in fact, the very notion of hospitality contains within it its opposite, its contradiction, which is marked here as hostility. Hospitality is not what it is. It is uncanny, and the home to which I welcome the absolute other is never truly a home. I reclaim the place given to the other and accuse the other, the foreigner, immigrant, refugee, of seeking to take my place, to steal from or replace me. Following Levinas and then Derrida, Sarah Ahmed defines hospitality as not only a responsibility to the other, the imperative to respond to the stranger that arrives, but as an ethical encounter. And of course, ethical, or the notion of ethics from ethos, which comes from culture, and the original root of ethos, which actually means the animal's home, is the den. In Strange Encounters, Ahmed says, the stranger becomes present in this ethical encounter as the one to whom one must give endlessly and without return. The endless obligation to give defines the form of hospitality as an opening to the other, an open home. End quote. It requires the host to give to their guests not only shelter without debt, but the home itself, the very laws of the household and of the homeland. What must be given in Ahmed's reading of hospitality, what must not only be given but given over in its entirety, is the very archive, homeland, and state. Hospitality, in Ahmed's sense, would require the home's foreclosure, home and homeland, and fundamentally a renunciation of the state. A true hospitality for Ahmed would welcome not only the unassimilable, but unassimilability as such. Hospitality would need to break its own law of hospitality. In the logic of the state, successful hospitality, successful immigration is almost always measured by the ratio of assimilation. For Ahmed, then, one welcomes in anything that calls itself a true hospitality, not only those unassimilable, but unassimilability itself. True hospitality must exceed the law, any law of hospitality. It must exceed the law as such, anonymously. anonymously because the animal is the one who stands outside the law. And animal is also the outlaw. Hospitality perhaps must always be anonymous. Animal, like Michel Foucault's mass philosopher, an outlaw. In his Le Monde interview from 1980, Foucault masked his identity by withholding his name. From behind the mask, anonymous and outside the law of identity or self or host, Foucault imagines a nameless criticism that would stand anonymously apart from the law, from the courts, and a form of criticism linked to judgment. It's an interview worth revisiting, again from 1980. Foucault proposes a game in which he said for 1 year, books would be published anonymously, and everyone would just have to read them and make criticism and interpretations without knowing who those authors are. And the interviewer pushes back and says, don't we assume that certain names and certain proper names have an obligation to offer us their critical views? And Foucault says he feels when he is masked, freer and heard, because there's no longer this kind of celebrity cult of the philosopher. And of course, by 1980, Foucault is easily a global celebrity philosopher. But what I'm interested in is the kind of criticism that Foucault imagines when masked, when one is anonymous. And the anonymity here, and I'm going to keep insisting on it even in a somewhat heavy-handed way, is linked not only to the lack of identity or of a facelessness, but quite literally to standing outside of the law, the nomos, to be outside of the law. So to be anonymous is not only to be unidentified, but to stand outside the law as an outlaw, as one who stands beyond the laws, for example, of identity or identification. And this is Foucault. I can't help but dream about a kind of criticism that would not try to judge, but to bring an oeuvre, a book, a sentence, an idea to life. It would light fires, watch the grass grow, listen to the wind, and catch the sea foam in the breeze and scatter it. It would multiply not judgments, but signs of existence. It would summon them, drag them from their sleep. Perhaps it would invent them sometimes, all the better. All the better. Criticism that hands down sentences sends me to sleep. I'd like a criticism of scintillating leaps of the imagination. It would not be sovereign or dressed in red. It would bear the lightning of possible storms. Foucault, in a return to the scene of Socrates' apology, sees criticism as a kind of trial, as a judgment, and the critic assuming the place here of the sovereign dressed in red, of the judge. That the role of the critic here identified is similar to and an extension of the sovereign, of the judge, as it were, of the state, and the practice of criticism would be understood as a trial. Instead, Foucault imagines a criticism that gives life, that brings life to the work, to the oeuvre, the storms, the fires, the light, as it were. It's an elemental criticism. Foucault's phantasmatic biocriticism, one that stands against and outside the law anonymously, is elemental. It gives life rather than handing down judgments and sentences. It marks the hospitality of an echo criticism that brings an oeuvre, a book, a sentence, an idea to life. Foucault's figure of the masked philosopher, heard because unidentified and unidentifiable, might also be understood as a persona non grata, unwelcome because masked. The persona is a masked person whose personality is defined by anonymity. Visible, audible, because invisible. It is the very mask in Foucault's logic that lets a person be seen. Such anonymity outside the law lets thought, criticism, be heard precisely because it no longer originates in the proper name, in the fantasy of personhood. Foucault affirms a faceless criticism, anonymous and perhaps impersonal, written from without by personae non gratae. Derrida follows a line, not a line of inquiry, not unlike Foucault's, to the very question of the question, and asks whether a true hospitality would not even ask the other's name, that an unconditional hospitality would welcome the nameless other by effacing, he says, not only the other's name, but the interrogation of the other. Does hospitality begin, he asks, with the unquestioning welcome, in double effacement, the effacement of the question and the name? Here, both the name and interrogation of the name are effaced. The other is faceless not because invisible or veiled, masked, but because their alterity, their state of statelessness has been effaced. What is effaced in this scenario is effacement itself. The state asserts itself against statelessness by erasing the separation of public and private space, a distinction, Derrida says, that makes hospitality possible. Without privacy, there can be no hospitality, only hostility. Here, privacy cannot be conflated with private property. Privacy aligns rather with anonymity, a facelessness outside the law that protects hospitality from the law, from the state. In the purview of the state, host and guest are held hostage. All persons before the state are, in the end, personae non grata. Such is the personae non grata hostage. For Derrida, Oedipus is the exemplary Greek figure rendered non grata. His transgressions are not merely against this or that law, against this or that state, but against humanity itself. Oedipus's transgressions, patricide and incest, have made him unwelcome non grata to all humanity. His fate is to die in exile, irreducibly foreign, in a secret and unmarked grave. The word human, thought to be a combination of the root homo for man and humus for earth, may define a form of being inextricable from the earth, from land unbounded by the state, or from any status. In hospitality, Derrida cites Kant's metaphysics of morals. He says, this is Kant, all men are entitled to present themselves in the society of others by virtue of their right to communal possession of the earth's surface. Since the earth is a globe, they cannot disperse over an infinite area, but must tolerate one another's company. And no one originally has any greater right than anyone else to occupy any particular portion of the earth. The right to occupy the earth, to share the earth's surface, is a precondition for Kant of hospitality. In this sense, true hospitality is global and comes from the earth itself. It neither comes from nor returns to the master or to any subject, but to the ground. What if humanity was unwelcome not by the state, which always expresses its hostile inhospitability to the other, but by something more elemental, the earth? And what if the very conditions of human being were marked by such unwelcomeness, defined by the irreducible inhospitability of a humanity non grata? If so, the persona non grata would not be a figure for disfigured humanity, for a humanity effaced, but rather the exemplary figure for humankind itself. In the end, perhaps, which is also to say after the end, and if we were to survive to live on past the end, we would not be post-human so much as ex-human. That which arises from the ashes of humanity, exhumed from the earth. A humanity disinterred, recovered from the earth, like Oedipus, whose swollen feet cause him always to arrive late and after the fact, buried in an unmarked grave elsewhere, a foreigner in a foreign land and stateless. A true humanities, and from it a true humanity, would be born by and of the earth's smooth and stateless hospitality. It would mark a humanity capable of overcoming its unwelcome past and earning the earth's hospitality. It would be a humanity no longer one with itself, a humanity that is not one, but reversible with the other, with the stranger and with strangeness as such, masked and not human. For hospitality to be universal, humanity must first become global and face the earth, its surface. masked, and non-human. Such would be a humanities born of a stranger's hospitality, a humanities that recognizes themselves in the irreducible strangeness of the earth's forgiveness.
Thanks very much for your talk. And at the end, you were saying that, I think you said either humanity must become global or humanities. I thought you said humanity. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate on what that means, what it would look like to have a humanity as something that's global, why it isn't already, and how it would be different in order to be manifest as a global phenomenon or ontology.
Thank you for that question. And I'm sorry if there is too much ellipses in the hysteria of this writing, which, as I said, the first writing I've done in 2.5 years and had to learn and relearn what it means to think and write. But thank you for that question. I'm trying to connect a few things here. You know, the idea of the state as a synthetic and artificial division of the land, what Kant calls the earth's surface, to which every human being is entitled. And the state creates these random and arbitrary lines, striated space, the construction of space that marks you as an outsider, that tells you where you belong and where you don't belong. Right? And this is the condition of the state, but also then of the hospitality or an economy of hospitality born of the state, which can tell somebody that you don't belong here, that can render people stranger, foreign, or homeless, even within their own countries. So what I'm referring to here is not merely global as in the sense of international, but global in the sense that if we are going to call for something like a universal hospitality, which is in fact always the imperative, right? That for hospitality to be what it is or what it says it is, there has to be universality. There cannot be a selective hospitality. We've asked questions when we see the horrors in Ukraine, why at times there is such a receptivity to the refugee and the immigrant, while not so at others. Right? And this raises serious questions about the selectivity of hospitality toward one group and not another group of refugees, for example. So when I say global, it has to exist on the earth, right? And that one would have to first recognize a humanity that allows, in fact, all human beings to exist equally on the earth. And that would be, for me, the precondition of anything that we might call hospitality, because it would require, before such a hospitality, a reconfiguration, if not complete dismantling, of what we also call the state, because it is the state and it is the apparatus of the state and all of its mechanisms, large and small, that tell people where they do and don't belong. So this was my sense. I will also add that I was thinking, because among all of the, let's say, tangible material crises that we have had to endure as recently as just a week ago, right? Unprovoked violence, which happens anywhere, for example. We are also dealing with a global violence committed by humanity against the earth. And what I would like to do is to think at some point, and this is in such a preliminary stage, the notion that Sarah Ahmed raises of giving, right, of an unconditional giving, and to link this notion of giving also to forgiving, as part of the scene of, for example, Socrates' trial. That one would have to imagine a humanity that asks for forgiveness, and it would have to be forgiven for the hospitality that humanity requires to return. Because I think it would have to be a return, because I don't think humanity, as it's been practiced and as it's been defined, is destined to survive. So it would have to be exhumed, which is why I'm calling it exhuman rather than exhuman. If you take out the hyphen, becomes exhume, rather than posthuman, which I feel has been the posthuman has become too facile and easy a phrase to refer to everything that exists as if something had ended, whereas I think it hasn't quite ended just yet.
Thank you, Akira. I heard humanities, not humanity, must be global, and I want to ask you. You made various references to the question of the university. As Humanities Institute directors, we are in the business of hospitality very often. That we try to welcome people into our space. We try to understand the humanities very often as a place of generosity, of conviviality in a variety of ways, and of the art of conversation that people have been bringing up as well as we've been discussing. And I'm trying to, one of the things that we've been discussing as a board, and I know that this has been, I was at ACLS a couple of weeks ago, and it was a discussion then too, is about how one actually thinks about the tensions between the desire for a global humanities on the one hand, and a planetary problem of moving around, of meeting together in spaces in the university in a way that is responsible to the hospitality to the planet, as it were. So I'm wondering if you could tease out a little bit the tension between the planetary and the global in the context of your suggestion that we keep thinking about the university. Thanks.
So, thank you, Franke. I mean, it's a huge question, and it makes me self-conscious of the fact that what I'm presenting is not meant to supersede anything that is nonetheless still required. Right? That one continue to practice in every way possible the acts of hospitality that allow these kinds of, or that forge these kinds of connections between individuals from around the world, from a kind of global, in that sense, humanities, as it were. That work never goes away, and the necessity of that work and the importance of that work never goes away. But I do think, and I've already seen so much evidence of it here, that to practice something like a global humanities is also to think and rethink the terms of that practice constantly. To ask, what happens, and sort of what are the terms by which things happen when one extends hospitality to another, when someone is invited and not someone else. And I think this is a larger problem for the university itself. I mean, the university in many ways is the last public sphere. Whether private or public, it still believes in something like the ethos of the public sphere, and it's under constant attack. I mean, it's the place that is perpetually, one could say, under attack. Now that issues like guns and abortion are off the table, it's just about destroying the university at this point. And so there has to be an understanding that those spaces are not merely open, that they have to be kept open. And one has to constantly think on every level what it means to keep those spaces open. On my campus, at the outset of the protests that followed the murder of George Floyd, we had students who say they don't feel, because of the color of their skin, that they are welcome at the university they attend. We have employees, faculty and staff who do not feel welcome at the universities where they're employed. And so one cannot take for granted, nor can one treat as incidental the kind of inhospitability that is also practiced within and as a part of the university's function. So I think that the value of centers and institutes of the humanities is always to continue to practice in every way possible those acts and those gestures, while also demanding that we think and rethink the terms by which those acts and gestures are defined in practice. There's a certain kind of, I think that work gets done. This would not be the place where I would consider our first problems reside.
Yeah, my name is James Ogude. I'm from the University of Pretoria. A very fascinating talk, and it really spoke to the heart of what I'm working on at the moment, and that is what Michel Serres would call, banished knowledges. And obviously, when we talk about banished knowledges, sometimes, they travel through a whole range of texts. And what you're talking about, in relation to hospitality, with regard to Derrida and Foucault, took me back, to certain African forms of knowledges. I'm currently working on the notion of Ubuntu, and in many ways, the concept of Ubuntu, at the heart of that concept is the idea of hospitality, and is one of those things that there's a joke within the African continent that one of their fundamental weaknesses was that they were, they extended too much hospitality. There's a story that goes to around a leader in Southern Africa called Lobengula. When the first missionaries came, he never asked questions. He just welcomed them unconditionally. Come in. The other issues will follow later. So in a sense, that idea of unconditional, hospitality, speaks to the heart of what, the concept of Ubuntu is all about, which in many ways embraces a fundamental understanding of our interdependence as human beings, one, but also the idea that when you give, it is not because you want to receive something. So that's one. The second thing is it reminded me of the Somalian writer, Nuruddin Farah. Nuruddin Farah has written a novel called Gifts. And Gifts, a very fascinating text, which came on the back of, the American invasion of Somalia. I don't know whether any of you remember that, but it was, covered all over, we now talk about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but we forget some of these other, invasions that we forget far too easily. And what Nuruddin Farah does in that text, in that novel, is to theorize the idea of gifting. Does a gift become a gift when in fact it is, it's got the trappings of, what we call, the need to, or what the Americans would call their international interest, for example, and that's a very tricky issue around the Horn of Africa. So it reminded me of that book by Nuruddin Farah, just theorizing, our understanding of gifts. Do you have the right to invade a country precisely because you are giving them, some aids, some gifts, what obligations do you have? Yeah. So I just wanted to make those remarks. Not so much of a question. Yeah.
No, thank you for that. Those are really helpful because it situates across a history, let's say, of colonialism and a kind of synthetic invention of the world as if these borders that have been drawn and redrawn, and in many cases, countries that have been created out of sort of ex nihilo, so to speak, and identities that are given. And we've seen this all over the world. We've seen it through the collapse of so-called empires, the breakup of Yugoslavia, in which, for example, Serbia and Croatia will eventually become completely distinct linguistically. So this idea that the world does not exist in an organic state. And in fact, part of what you're referring to with the kind of banished knowledges is linked, to the idea that there are knowledges that exist before and outside of the state that would exist anonymously. Listening to, I was thinking of my colleague at Irvine, where I used to teach, in the International Center for Writing and Translation. And what Ngugi wa Thiong'o was doing as his first project upon his appointment was to translate into indigenous languages work that had been written by colonial subjects in colonial languages, right? So that you would have Senegalese writing in French, for example, and the indigenous languages of the region were disappearing, right? So through an act, which when he was telling me about it, I found incredible and ironic that one would translate not the languages of indigenous works into European languages, but actually to take European languages written by indigenous writers and put them back into languages that were not theirs initially, right? And that this act and gesture of moving to restoring somewhere an archive that would exist, even if the subjects of that language no longer did, would be a certain act, let's say, of creating, even in the absence of one seeking hospitality, a kind of hospitality in events, right? It would give to that language a place where that work would exist, even if all the readers and writers of that language no longer did. And so I think the questions that you're raising, and of course the idea of this unconditional hospitality, which often leads to ruin, right? Because one gives away, right, something which is then taken and stolen, and then one ends up displaced. And there is a history of the world that can be written around those incidents alone. Yeah, thank you. I'll stop there, but thank you for those comments. It really made me think about the broader frame.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderfully evocative talk, and so much richness there. I'm particularly taken by this idea of the ex-human. But I actually wanted to build on the first question. You ended so beautifully with this idea of the Earth's forgiveness. And I just wanted to invite you to talk a little bit more about that. It's tantalizing to me. What would it mean to be forgiven by the Earth? What are the signs by which we can tell that we are forgiven? And what would it mean to atone to an entity which by most definitions doesn't have a face?
No, that's a great question. Of course, I ended there because it's the least developed of what I'm thinking. But it occurred to me that it's not. I started by saying, what is the end for us here? Where does it all end? We wouldn't know where to start if we weren't assured that it does end, right? Because if it doesn't end, then it doesn't start. So we have to know that it ends. Even if it hasn't ended, we have to know that there is an end. And it occurred to me the ends that we speak of, most typically are like the end of the human, the end of humanity, which does not necessarily mean an apocalypse in which all human life ends. Right? Hegel, Kojève speak of the end of history, right? And then Francis Fukuyama keeps talking about the end of history. As Derrida said, he took the last train to the end of history and he still showed up late. And he's talking about it again. But the end of history also, Kojève has that very weird, his lectures on Hegel, he has a very weird little footnote in which he says, the end of history, we just go back to animality. Right? Because human beings don't end when history ends, but the human ends. And we just go back to being animals, and we enjoy sunsets, and we have contentment. We no longer have happiness. We no longer have art. We no longer have love, but we have, contentment. We feel okay. We eat, we play, we look at beautiful things and so forth. And we talk about the end of the Anthropocene, but all of those presuppose that there is in some form human life afterward. Right? Maybe not the Anthropocene, but somewhere in there. And I'm thinking, what would we have to use your question of what would the sign be? How would we know when it's ended? How do we know when it's over? And it seems to me that if it did end, and if we were to survive somehow, we would only do so with this kind of forgiveness, which I would want to link to giving, to a kind of hospitality. Because I think, and this goes to the previous comment about that you made about this kind of unconditional hospitality, which is what might have been given to us by the earth, right? Which we have ravaged, right? Absolutely so. So for there to be something like a humanity, and that's why I wouldn't call it post-humanity. The post-humanity always struck me as too euphoric, you know. It was too cybernet. It was cyborgian. It, you know, it's like the world of Blade Runner. It's not that easy. I think that it has to be buried once. And if there is an ex-human that is exhumed from the earth, like Pinocchio's body carved out of the tree, right? That it would have to be forgiven, right? For such a thing to resume, to return. And perhaps it would no longer be called humanity. Maybe that would no longer be the word. Why I made that shift, and I'm sorry if it was not as rigorous as it should be, and I tried to do it earlier, that humanity would always have to exist in some form of multiplicity. And I would want to link that to the idea of the gender pronoun as being in multiple, right? The they and them structure, which I've had to overcome grammatically because I was taught, you know, never, anyway, you know what I'm talking about. But the idea that we would allow this multiplicity to be not just the humanities as in a cluster of fields of knowledge that we collectively call the humanities, but the humanities itself, and this might be, to return to Ranji's question, would have to be understood as irreducibly multiple. And maybe somewhere in there, once we give up, you know, I read the quotes in their original translations where they just say man, man. And there's something so inappropriate and obsolete about that reference to the male, so the male pronoun or he or him. But it would have to follow something like this, where we would have to relinquish the notion of a humanity, and I would argue of a humanism, you know, that would still aspire to something like a collective singularity. Right? We'd have to move in the opposite direction. I'm sorry, that's so underthought in response to your question, but the question is a wonderful one.
I wanted to ask a question after James, actually. I think there might be some points of connection there. I really appreciated your comments. To hear your thoughts about hospitality, or rethinking hospitality as a way of rethinking American exceptionalism. And the title of your talk provoked me to think about you know, indigenous communities in the US and Canada, all over the world, as persona non grata, in a sense, right, in the context of colonialism. And I was also reminded of Ali Bidad's work, where he cautions us, right? He talks about, you know, this myth of, you know, the United States as a nation of immigrants, right? And it's something that presidents have used, you know, strategically, and, you know, it's a cliche, but it's something that in our cultural memory we have sort of internalized at the detriment of pushing this knowledge and indigenous notions of hospitality, right? What would we learn about the earth and our future on the earth by turning to indigenous ways of knowing, right? How does hospitality look like? Sound like, is imagined from various indigenous perspectives. I don't know if it's a fully formulated question, but I really wanted to turn our thought towards this, and especially in the context of, I think, Ali Bidad in his most recent book calls this a suppression of acknowledging the violence of the US colonial project, right? And what would it mean to rethink, to unearth that violence in order to rethink discourses of hospitality in a nation of immigrants? And I'm speaking as an immigrant myself.
Thank you for that question. Of course, as I was writing this paper, the question of indigeneity is actually driving the whole thing, because you know, the indigenous of the world are not immigrants. That's also why I ask, where do we begin? And it's also why I wanted to take this phrase, persona non grata, which has a very specific usage, and to ask whether, in fact, it doesn't describe a set of practices that extend far more broadly than the kind of narrow diplomatic spaces in which it's used specifically. And that, as you say, the indigenous are the persona non grata because they precede the constitution of the state, which is why they are always outside of it, because they are before it. And so they are never covered. And so the indigenous, and I should make a specific point when we talk about humanism protecting the human, because the violence that is embedded within the otherwise beautiful notion of hospitality to all humans is that not everybody is a human. Right? And the indigenous would be an instance in which the state does not recognize, even as a part of the state. Right? In the case of the United States, at least, the kind of sovereign territory of the indigenous of the tribal lands is to exist literally in a state of anonymity outside of the law. So I think your point is absolutely right. And to connect further the relationship between indigenous, in many instances, the relationship to the earth, right? And that kind of banished knowledge that James is talking about, all that is lost in the erasure of indigenous knowledges, which of course exists for millennia before, in the case of the North America, for example, that states are formed or founded, will have to be part of the kind of forgiveness, the structure of forgiveness, which is to give in advance, right? To forgive is a kind of hospitality that is not actualized on the occasion of this gesture, but would have to exist in advance. And that would have to extend the notion of a global humanities, as Kant says, strangely enough, because Kant is not exactly the person you turn to in these kinds of questions, that everybody has an equal right to the surface of the earth. And that would be a kind of a reimagining of a kind of forgiveness that would welcome back, as it were, the stateless and foreign indigenous cultures that have been effaced, as it were, by the state.
So I've been given the signal that we're at time, and this gives me the opportunity to thank you again for this beautiful talk. And I'm going to add one more thing, which is I'm going to speak on behalf of all of you, if I might, and say we're so glad that you have returned to writing. All right.